Hello. It's time for one of those hobby benches again, where I talk about what I've been up to in my hobby and on the channel over the course of the last month or so. This is just going to be a really informal exploration of the various things that I've been getting up to. So hopefully you are here to enjoy just a little bit of a chat with me and Martha. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and it's time for a hobby bench. So there's been quite a lot of stuff happening here on the channel over the last month or so. It was March when I did my last hobby bench and I talked about Big April and what was coming up. But now we've got so many elephants in so small a room. Lots to talk about how April actually went and all of the sort of stuff I've been up to on the channel and off the channel as well. So let's start with Big April and the releases that I put out during the month. This was a chance for me to celebrate the 6th month anniversary of Jordan Sorcery here on YouTube. I wanted it to be a really big event to kind of feel like a bit of a celebration, to put a few special videos out and to also celebrate the launch of my Patreon that I just put up at the start of the month as well. So to that end, I launched my series, The Making of Warhammer. The intention was to release 4 episodes over the course of the month. Each one was going to cover 2 editions of Warhammer. I wanted it to be a little bit more detailed than a retrospective because I'd already done that every edition of Warhammer video at the start of April. This one was going to be a little bit more about the context and about the people behind the creation of Warhammer, the artists, the writers, the game designers, of course, and sort of really try and tell that story. But the more research that I did, the more that story just grew arms and legs like some kind of chaos spawn. And there was just too much to fit into these kind of shorter videos that I'd imagined originally. I think it was the right choice to break it down into more detailed, longer videos. So I still did the first and second editions and Reaper, the game that came before Warhammer, in that first video. But then the third edition, which was going to be bundled with fourth, I broke into its own video. And that then became a half-hour exploration of that transition from the very simple, kind of friendly game between mates, storytelling, roleplay inspired version of Warhammer that the first and second editions had been, and then that move into a far more formalized war game. So third edition being a set of rules that were trying to be as comprehensive as they could be, that covered loads and loads of different situations and scenarios that you might get, that introduced more points values and more balanced kind of army lists, and really laid the foundations for the Warhammer that would run through the next number of editions until, obviously, Age of Sigmar took over. So that story, it really did just get quite big, as you probably would expect if you were planning this thing and given it due consideration, which I maybe hadn't. I think that's really served those videos. I'm really proud of those 3 parts that I've released so far. I think that it is an incredibly interesting story, and I do believe, like I said at the start of the video, in many ways, not in every way, but in many ways, Warhammer kind of traces the story of Games Workshop. So you have that first 10 years under Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone, and then as Brian Ansell takes over, once Citadel has been established and once you've had your first and second editions, you then get this story of Warhammer that kind of traces and moves in through all of the different changes within the corporate structure at Games Workshop, within the way that they produce their miniatures, the way that they produce their games. All of these different business decisions are reflected in Warhammer and how Warhammer evolves. And obviously, 40k is a major part of that, and all of the other specialist games and everything else Games Workshop did. But there's definitely this through line for Warhammer that kind of tells a very particular story for an era of Games Workshop's history. I'm currently working on the next part, so 5th edition of Warhammer. I know there are some people who do feel still that 4th and 5th edition could have been bundled together. I think it was right to separate those 2 out as well, because yes, they are very similar from a rules perspective, but there's some really interesting changes that occur during the course of the 5th edition that warrant exploring on their own as well. And the things like how they built-in backwards compatibility and the mindset behind the development of 5th edition versus the development of later editions is worth exploring, and all of the cultural shifts that are happening within Games Workshop itself as a corporate entity, but also within the gamers and the fans of Warhammer and how customers were changing as well. Those kinds of things we can explore through the 5th edition, and sure, it might not be quite as detailed or as big a video as some of the other ones. It's still an interesting starting point that we will then contrast when we get into 6th and 7th and obviously 8th edition in those stories, because of the changes that we start to see from 4th into 5th and then beyond. So that's something I'm working on at the moment. I was maybe a little bit over ambitious when I thought I could put out one every single week through April, as well as a regular video. So that is why it's been a couple of weeks since we actually had part 3. Part 4, which actually covers the 5th edition, inconveniently, that will be coming soon. I'm working on that right now. I'm scripting it up and getting ready to film all of that stuff and put it together. So hopefully that will be on the channel very soon. The other videos that I put out during Big April, you hopefully have seen these. Some of these were a bit silly, a bit fun. Obviously, I did that retrospective of every edition of Warhammer. I wanted to just start the story of Warhammer by just going, okay, what's the full picture? What was released over the course of 40 years, all 8 editions, the key releases that came out for that. Basically just tell that story very, very simply. So this came out, and here's what it looked like. Then this came out, to give you that timeline so that then you can go and start looking at the deeper dives, and then there's a sort of context around which to build the exploration of 1st and 2nd edition, and 3rd, and then 4th, and so on. The next video that came out in the month was the was the films that feel like Warhammer. So if you've been with the channel for a little while, you will have seen that I did a similar version of this for 40k. A few films that I feel they could be set in the 40k universe. They've obviously inspired some stuff or been inspired by the games from Games Workshop. It's not a serious list. It's not an exhaustive list. The Warhammer one is the same. Just a few films that I think kind of capture that essence, that spirit of Warhammer. So that was fun to make. And then I did combat cards. So Citadel combat cards, which I absolutely loved as a kid. Very, very simple. Games Workshop top trumps. Just really fun. And that was just a nice palette cleanser, almost a very simple video to research and make that I could put out alongside the other stuff. Unfortunately, I then fell ill at the end of the month. So that was why we didn't get anything for the end of Big April. So whilst I wanted it to be this massive crescendo, and I was going to release a major project, I was going to release the next Warhammer video, I was basically stopped in my tracks because I'd fallen ill. I couldn't work on anything. That basically put me out for almost a week. And then that kind of slowed me down when I got back to it. So that's unfortunately why there were a couple of weeks where there was just nothing to be released. So one of the things I kind of have taken from that is that, yeah, I probably want to have some break glass videos in the can. So the major release I then put out, of course, you might have seen, hopefully you've been on the adventure, is the interactive history of fighting fantasy. This was something that I've been thinking about for months. I've been sort of slowly plotting this in the background of my mind. This was a huge undertaking. I'm not going to get into too many specifics about it because there's kind of spoilers if I reveal too much about how big it is and how many videos are in it. But essentially, if you haven't seen it, Fighting Fantasy, the adventure game books that were created by Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone, they were a major part of my childhood. Absolutely loved those. Island of the Lizard King was just a huge favourite. I spent so many times trying to get through that game book. If you're not familiar with them, essentially it's a book that's written in a non-linear way. Every single paragraph or set of paragraphs is numbered. At the end of each section, you are given a choice. And if you decide to do one thing, you will turn to a certain page. If you decide to do another thing, you'll turn to a different page somewhere else. It is definitely the kind of thing that inspired Silver Tower and how the Silver Tower quest book works. So it's something that I absolutely love. One of the reasons I love Silver Tower is because of that sort of that randomized, non-linear dynamic to its storytelling. Fighting Fantasy does that in an incredible way. It is choose your own adventure, but it's also a game because you get to have some stats and you're rolling dice and you're fighting monsters. Fantastic series of books, really inventive and creative stuff, and beautiful, beautiful art. That series I wanted to explore and do a history of, but it definitely felt like there was a way here to do something a bit more interactive and interesting. So I've used the end cards that are on YouTube, so the recommended cards that come up at the end of a video, to present those choices. So instead of just doing, here are all the different chapters of a history of fighting fantasy, I've broken those apart, and you get to choose which direction you want to go in. So do you want to know more about this topic or that topic? And then you make that choice, and then you watch that video. Obviously, because it's fighting fantasy, I wanted to create that fantasy theme. So I worked with an artist called Hani Kayal, and he's done these amazing fantasy-style sigils that are used as all the thumbnails and the intros to all the videos. They are kind of... riddle is too strong a word, but they are supposed to be this kind of clue, if you like, this fantasy-themed clue to what the topic might be that you might watch. But it doesn't give it away too clearly. So there's an element of choice and there's an element of chance and sort of gambling with it. It wouldn't be a fighting fantasy game book if it didn't also have some instant deaths as well. So there are some routes that you can go down where actually, you know what, you shouldn't have chosen this one. This one's a dangerous pathway. You still get some information, you still get a little bit of history, but that's a dead end, and you then have to go back to the other decision. Now, there's also secrets in there, there's hidden treasures, there are bits of equipment that you can get, there are monsters that you can fight. There's also a very, very secret, which I have hidden, which you have to watch and get through to the end in order to work out how to go back and unlock that secret. So yeah, really, really fun putting that together. I've written a pretty detailed sort of behind the scenes, a making of how I made this fighting fantasy adventure. And that talks about how long it is. It talks about the total combined video length and the number of videos and what I actually did in order to create the different components and all that sort of stuff. That is on my Patreon, so my patrons get to see that blog post that just talks about that behind the scenes stuff. And that was just because I wanted to document somewhere how I had actually produced this, as much for myself as for anybody else, because it was a big investment of time and effort. But I thought it would be a fun thing to share with patrons and sort of provide a little bit more insight. If you want to support the work I'm doing here on the channel, then you are more than welcome to join the Patreon. You can go to the link in the description and check that out. I really do appreciate everybody's support who has already become a patron. I appreciate your support if you watch this video and like this video and subscribe to the channel as well. But that's also a further way that you can support this channel and sort of help me to do more of this stuff more often. Right, that's enough about the channel, I think, for now. So let's talk a little bit about the sort of hobby bench. What have I been up to inside and outside of the hobby? It was a super busy month for me in terms of the actual production, so I was really working so hard to create those Warhammer documentaries and the other videos as well. That really limited the amount of time I had to do hobby stuff, especially because I was doing a lot of research when I wasn't doing the filming or the editing as well. So that kind of really swallowed up a lot of reading time, for instance. So I've not really read an awful lot over the course of this month, whereas normally I try and read at least a couple of books and sort of keep moving forward with my reading list. I wasn't able to do that this month. I was able to take a little break to go to Warhammer Fest. So that was in Manchester. Interesting event. I did have a fun time. I hooked up with a friend of mine, and we just and a couple of friends of mine. We went on a sort of wander around the day. We just went there for the one day on the Sunday, took in all of the sights, and kind of enjoyed that. It was a great excuse to hang out with friends, talk about Warhammer stuff, check out all the Golden Demon stuff, and just be amazed by all of that awesome stuff, and to be in a setting that was conducive to just really fun energy and sort of a vibe of, you know what, everybody here loves the same things I love. We might have different takes on all of this stuff, but we're all here because we're big fans of Warhammer and the Games Workshop stuff, the games, the hobby. So I really did enjoy that, got a lot out of that. It was just a great excuse to be in that mindset and to just disconnect from everything else and just be in the hobby. It feels very much to me like the third-party contributions to Warhammer Fest were probably better than the Games Workshop contributions. As much as they facilitated everything, there wouldn't have been a Warhammer Fest. It wouldn't have been in such an amazing venue. It wouldn't have been such a big event. The actual Games Workshop components to it didn't feel like the funnest parts. Sure, they set up Golden Demon, but the Golden Demon entries were the fun part of that, and seeing all this amazing stuff that people had produced. They created the opportunity to do things like the Hobby Challenge, which admittedly I didn't do, which I do think is really super fun, so that's on me. The tournaments, obviously that's great as well, which I also didn't get involved with, so that's on me. But then the actual coolest stuff in the venue was like the third-party video game stalls, and there was an amazing set of displays from all of these different companies who were advertising their video games. They looked awesome. You could take a look at like Bolt Gun and stuff like that. That was cool. That isn't necessarily the sort of Games Workshop of it all. The Titan Owners Club was the coolest demo game that was on display. That looked amazing, but you couldn't partake in that because obviously it was, run by and for the Titan Owners Club. There weren't any participation games, really. They had a handful of tables doing demo games for 10th edition. Not nearly enough to cover the huge volume of people who were there specifically to try out stuff like that. And I'm perhaps using, rose-tinted, grognard kind of goggles here. But I remember many years ago, as a much younger gamer, going to Games Days at the NEC in Birmingham, and the number of different participation games that they had was absolutely amazing. You could just jump straight in to all of these awesome games. You could be playing just wild, inventive versions of the games that just used the 40k and Warhammer games as a starting point to then say, what if we did this scenario? What if we created this wild story or this wild opportunity to play a game in a way that you wouldn't do at home because you don't have access to thousands and thousands and thousands of points, or 1,000,000 of this, or 100 of that, or 1,000 of the other. So I remember one of my absolute favorite events at a Games Day was you were told ahead of time to bring your own cavalry unit. I think I had 3 painted Dark Elf Cold One Riders at the time, so I brought those along. You'll probably remember the ones where if you didn't pin the tails would fall off constantly. I didn't know how to pin anything. I was not a modeler at all. So I just had these tailless cold ones, and there was this enormous table. Everyone lined up all of their cavalry units on one side, and on the other side, there was just this wall, literal wall of a fortress, dwarven fortress, built into this rocky rock face, this mountainscape. I think it was called the Guns of Carrack Varn or something like that. I think it was a play on the Guns of Navarone. And there was just hundreds and hundreds of dwarven guns and mortars and flame cannons and all sorts of stuff like that. And the idea was that you, as the cavalry units, had to charge across the battlefield, taking an absolute barrage of cannon fire. If you made it, and if you destroyed any cannon, then you would get to keep it. You didn't just get to keep it, you got to decide if you wanted to put the cannon onto a block of wood and take a hammer and just destroy it. So if you wanted, you could just destroy the cannon and just for fun, or you could keep it and take it home. Obviously, you wouldn't be able to do anything like that now, but to have this incredible opportunity to just have cavalry from every army in the Warhammer world with just combined force charging across the battlefield, trying to take out these dwarven guns, and people were just getting blown up and torn apart and completely wiped out, left, right, and center. It was an incredible experience. For the record, I didn't manage to get across the battlefield to take a cannon out, but there was a misfire when one of the cannons did try and strike me, and it did cause the cannon to blow up. So they counted that as me winning. I was way too greedy at the time with my greedy mitts, and I was all over that cannon. I did not destroy it. I absolutely claimed it and took it home. And then I think someone also gave me one of the mortars that they had won because they didn't want it. And then one of the kids who actually decided to destroy the cannon using the hammer, it was this twisted metal chassis of the cannon was all that was left. and he was just like, do you want this? So I took that as well, and then I used that when I had a misfire in my games. It actually caused me to start creating collecting a dwarf army as a result of it, because it was just awesome to have these amazing painted miniatures. That is the kind of participation game that I absolutely love. You know, there was stuff like Eldar Jetbike Jousting, I remember, 3D versions of Space Hulk, 3D versions of Warhammer Quest, just these really fun, different takes on the game that you couldn't do anywhere else. I think that the opportunity to do that, it's, you know, once a year is the kind of place that you absolutely can see that kind of stuff. Oddly enough, at the Warhammer World Anniversary event, they did have a couple of participation games that took exactly that kind of approach. They had a sort of chariot racing game earlier this year. I don't know why that kind of thing wasn't present at Warhammer Fest. I think it's just stuff that excites people about the hobby. It's just great to play. And then it just gets you using miniatures in a fun, interesting way. So I do think that was a missed opportunity. I think the announcements were fine. You know, that's all good. It's actually probably better to watch the announcements on streaming. I watched the Saturday announcements on streaming, and that was fantastic. Didn't actually see the announcements on the Sunday because the queue was enormous to get in. The other thing that, of course, is missing, and I'm glad many people have pointed this out, so I'll just add my voice here to the chorus. The removal of any kind of the creative stuff from Games Workshop from the event, I think, is a real shame. Obviously, there's everybody who was working at the event did a tremendous job, but there's a huge opportunity there that's been squandered, I think, by Games Workshop to have the people who write the games, who test the games, who do the art for these games, and who paint and produce all of those miniatures, getting to speak to those individuals, getting to see a little bit of how they work and how they think about the game and what excites them about the game, that has always been one of the funnest parts of any kind of major event for Games Workshop, I think. I've got a lot out of it. Again, the Warhammer World Anniversary, I got to spend some time talking to the Cubicle 7 team just about how they were producing the role-playing game, the Warhammer Fantasy role-playing game. That was really interesting, and I just had a great conversation with them that I really enjoyed. It was super memorable. I remember speaking to the Hogshead team about Warhammer Fantasy roleplay way back when. Those kinds of conversations are just fantastic to see that sort of stuff, to be able to flick through some of the artists' portfolios, to see the conversions or the paint jobs that they've done on their own miniatures that may offer a glimpse into what the future might hold, or it might not. It might just be for fun. Those kinds of things, I think, are a huge loss to the kind of Games Workshop event, the fest of it all. So yeah, I think the third-party stuff, the Golden Demon, the cosplay parades, all of the third-party vendors, and some of that just extra stuff, just being able to talk to friends and meet people, that was really cool. I really enjoyed that. I hope that they take heed from some of this discussion that there's been online and some of the videos and reflections from people, and maybe think about, okay, how could we maybe do a little bit more to bring this back to life for the next one. So there's my 2 cents. I probably dwelled on it longer than I should have, but yeah, it was a fun day, but it wasn't as fun as it perhaps could have been. So let's talk Hobby Bench. I, of course, as I say, haven't had a chance to do an awful lot of actual hobbying this month. There was, though, a bit of a weird sort of magical event, I think. So on the last Hobby Bench, I talked about my Empire army that I'm building themed around Marienburg. This is an army that I would like to be usable in every edition of Warhammer and Age of Sigmar and the Old World as well. So 10 different game systems, in fact. So I'm being kind of entitled. But I was sort of thinking about, okay, how do I put this army together? I put a poll on Twitter talking about whether or not I should use round bases or square bases or which size of square base. That poll actually came out in favor of using original square bases. And then obviously you can scale them up using movement trays for Old World if necessary. What I want to do in this army is use lots of different era of Games Workshop model, Citadel model. So instead of the Birdmen of Cataraza, I'm using the Barda Gargoyles. The Gargoyles, every single time I say that word, it disappears somewhere into my throat. So the Barda Gargoyles, I'm going to be using those as the Birdmen. So that Regiment of Renown from 2nd edition of Warhammer, I think they're fantastic. Their background is built around Marienburg. It was actually the first appearance of Marienburg in the lore. Barda von Mickelstein, the sorcerer, accidentally brought these gargoyles to life. They are demonic lesser demons. These creatures, they wreaked havoc in Marienburg until they were brought under control. Barda von Mickelstein was executed as a result of his silliness, and then the Barda gargoyles became something that sorcerers of demonic sorcerers of Marienburg were able to use in the defense of the city over time. Obviously, that lore has changed substantially with the later editions, but I still think there's a fantastic sort of nugget of lore there. So I'm using those guys. I want to do pirate-themed ogres. I have got the Regiment of Renowned Longdrongs pirate slayers. So I'm going to be using those as the dwarves in the army. But I mentioned in the video last time that I'd sort of become a little bit obsessed with the idea of getting hold of a Marienburg class landship. These are super rare Forge World miniatures. They're really expensive now. You very, very rarely see them available to buy. There are recasts out there that are just a bit dodgy and a bit difficult to get hold of. And then after mentioning it on the video, very shortly after, one became available online. And I could not stop myself from purchasing it. So I now have a Marienburg class landship. Now, this is an absolutely wonderful model. It is truly incredible. I cannot wait to have this assembled and to be able to use this. I've said before on the channel, I'm not a great modeler. I don't have a lot of technical skills. I'm not a great painter either. So what this is going to look like when I finally complete it, I have no idea. What is going to be super interesting is the build for this particular piece. So, but basically there are a huge number of bits of warping and gaps between the different pieces. Very, very rough looking pieces. There's going to have to be quite a lot of work to get this thing ship shape. I'm probably going to document some of this project because, like I say, I'm not good at this kind of thing. I'm going to have to do a lot of research on how to fix certain parts of it and how to make the best of the build and how to make sure it doesn't fall apart again, how to make sure it doesn't warp again. I'm going to have to learn a lot in order to do this, and I want to do this piece justice. So I'm going to probably film myself making a hash of quite a lot of it, and I'll probably share that at some point. I just need to find the hobby time to actually invest in doing it. I am looking to, at some point later in the year, create a bit of a battle report, but I want to do that with an umpire. I want this to be a sort of classic Warhammer scenario. So we'll have, they won't be balanced forces. It's going to be a storytelling game. We're going to have the umpire there to manage the battle and to make sure that it's still a fair game, but that we're together telling the story of this battle. But I think that's going to be really fun. So that's something much, much later in the year. So that's not coming anytime soon. One thing that I have been doing in the hobby space is continuing a D&D campaign. So a group of friends and I are doing a virtual Dungeons and Dragons. We are doing the Ghosts of Saltmarsh campaign. We're in our third sort of season of that campaign at the moment, and it is just absolutely fantastic fun. Really enjoying it. My character, Abigail Latchkey, is basically a former musketeer who had to run when her kingdom was overtaken by Ayuts and the forces of evil, and she's found herself in Saltmarsh, and she's teamed up with this group of heroes, and we're doing all sorts of stuff like saving lizard folk and befriending vampires and trying to steal standing stones to defeat dragons and all sorts of good stuff. Lots of really, really fun storytelling in that campaign, and the Games Master has been absolutely amazing at just weaving in all of the backstories from all of the different players. It's absolutely the best kind of campaign you could hope for, where you've created a character and you've built it with loads of hooks and loads of backstory and loads of potential futures, and then the GM has really found a way to make all of those different stories come together in a sort of really satisfying and interesting way that you can explore together. And we each have different times in the spotlight, and we each drive the narrative at different times. Fantastic. So just the best kind of D&D campaign for me personally, and how I love to play it. My patrons were able to complete their vote in April for what the priority from their perspective should be for one of my next videos. They have chosen the history of Mordheim. So Very soon, we'll have the history of Mordheim coming up on the channel. Very excited about that. It's such a fantastic game to spend time with, and there's some really interesting ideas behind how they created it and why they created it and how it sits in the broader context of Warhammer at the time. Obviously, I'll touch on that in the making of, but then being able to drill into that specifically around Mordheim and the making of Mordheim as well, it's a really fun opportunity. So yeah, I'm very excited about getting more into that and sort of doing more detailed stuff on that. My patrons are currently deciding on what the priority is going to be for a next video down the line. That one, I wanted to make it less Games Workshop specific. So they're currently having a decision at the moment. I'm running the poll at the moment about whether or not I will be looking at the Tomb of Ayuchiban from the first edition of Legend of the Five Rings, the role-playing game. There is an extremely, extremely dangerous dungeon. Basically, it was L5R's version of the D&D Tomb of Horrors, which is designed to just kill entire parties of adventurers with almost impossible to solve puzzles. I think it's a really cool theme and a really cool idea, and I think there is a way to tell that story really, really well, and it is a fantastic read, so that is one of the options to talk about that. Another option is the Sans Detour French version of Call of Cthulhu. They made some absolutely beautiful prestige editions of the game, magnificent collections of the scenarios, some of the biggest scenarios, Masks of Nyarlathotep and some of the others. Absolutely gorgeous. One of the best productions of a role-playing game I have ever seen. Another option is still Games Workshop related. It's a battle retort, but it's around Warhammer Quest 1995. I think it would probably be Lair of the Orc Lord. So I would start that campaign and tell the story of the adventurers going into the Gorguts dungeon and how the story progresses. So use the game to create this new story about a new set of characters. What happens in the game then becomes the narrative that I share through the storytelling exercise. And then the final option is the board game for Monster Squad. This was a film that came out, I think, the late 80s, early 90s. It features Dr. Acula and the Mummy, Gillman, and the Werewolf, and Frankenstein's monster. And it's basically one of those really campy sort of Goonies kind of kids films where this group of universal monsters are trying to destroy a small town in America, and the kids have to team up to try and stop them. The board game is fun and total nonsense, so it would just be about that game and talking about it, basically. So those are the options that the patrons are currently voting on. We'll see what comes out on top. It's kind of neck and neck, actually. There's a lot of different options that are going up and down. The only one that's sort of trailing behind is the Call of Cthulhu, so that probably won't be what the video is. It's up to you. You can make that change. But yeah, that's what we've got coming up. There's lots of other fun stuff as well. And the making of Warhammer continues very soon on the channel. So that is it for this month's Hobby Bench. I know it was a little bit rambly. I spent probably too long talking about the channel and probably too long talking about Warhammer Fest as well. Not an awful lot of time talking about hobby benches at all. Lots to look forward to on the channel. I hope that you join me over the next couple of weeks and the next couple of months, because I think there's going to be some stuff that people really enjoy. Thank you very much for watching. I am Jordan, this is Martha, and this is Jordan's Sorcery. Oh boy. We are in a whole lot of trouble, Martha.